New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, Mind, Body, Spirit University, a leader in fully accredited in-person and online U.S. college degree programs in the topics we cover here. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Our topic today is UFOs and UAP. Can we penetrate the paradox? My guest is Keith Thompson, an author and independent journalist. Over 30 years ago, I interviewed him about his book, Angels and Aliens, UFOs, and the Mythic Imagination. I think that interview represents one of the most sophisticated approaches I know to the study of UFOs. And as a matter of fact, I'm going to link to it right now for those of you who are able to collect this link on your computer. You can find that 30-year-old interview by clicking in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. Keith's newest book is The UFO Paradox, the celestial and symbolic world of unidentified aerial phenomena. We're going to have an opportunity for those of you who are familiar with the original interview to see how much Keith Thompson has learned over the intervening 30 years. Keith lives in Florida. And now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Keith. It's a pleasure to be with you after so many decades.
Indeed, Jeff. It feels like we're beginning a conversation after a short break, and we're continuing where we left off. Let's do that.
Indeed, it does feel that way. I've encouraged our viewers, incidentally, to watch that old interview more than 30 years ago. I just viewed it myself in preparation for our conversation today. And I have to say, it felt very contemporary. It felt like we could be doing the same interview today. But I know your thinking has evolved, obviously, over 30 years.
Yeah, it really has. So we can explore. Maybe I'll find out what I've learned if you ask me the questions that can elicit that information. I don't know what I've written until someone asks me to talk about it.
Well, let's start with this point. A couple of times now, in our prior conversations leading up to this interview, you've mentioned your admiration for the work of Bernardo Kastrup, whom I've had the pleasure of interviewing more than a dozen times on this channel. So let me ask you why you think his work is very relevant to the UFO question.
He has raised the question and the non sequitur, really, of the modern physicalist, materialist worldview, which seems wedded to the idea that somehow consciousness developed out of dead, inert forms. That is what materialism, physicalism insists, that the ground of being is dead, lifeless matter, but somehow it out of mass, spin, charge, momentum, quantitative elements that the physicalist model depends on, physical science as we acknowledge it, somehow managed to develop subjectivity, the ability to taste an orange, to smell a rose, to feel the pain of heartbreak. That doesn't make any sense. So, and partly because it doesn't make sense intuitively and as an inference of reality, also based on experiences that I have had, not in the UFO world, but with a near-death experience I had many years ago before I even knew anything about the near-death experience, knew about the stages. There was a directness of the awareness that there was a sense of that awake awareness is the actual state of everything. It is always already here. So the question is, how do we get the sense there's something other than consciousness? And Bernardo has addressed those issues very well. Now, what does it have to do with UFOs? It's certainly, there are many aspects of the UFO phenomenon. The apparent ships or craft that come into view, show up on radar, have temperature indications, a sense of propulsion, a sense of movement, show up with ground indentations and other markers of physical signs, and then they split into two, they change their density, they disappear into the ground or disappear like the Cheshire Cat, just disappear from plain view. So there is an element of consciousness that has to be included in this conversation, and the paranormal, the parapsychological dimensions are not, they're not optional. They're intrinsic to this phenomenon. So as to Bernardo Kastrup, he's addressed the UFO issue. He's addressed absurdity. He's addressed the paranormal. But he's also said, as you know, he's often asked, what do you think of the paranormal as challenging the materialist worldview? He said, it does. But we don't need the paranormal to challenge the materialist worldview. It doesn't explain ordinary consciousness very well. And that's my own sense. How do we account for consciousness as something that is intrinsic?
My own view, incidentally, I might as well lay it out, is that we won't understand normal consciousness until we come to terms with the paranormal. That's the reverse of the conventional viewpoint, which is we have to understand normal consciousness. Only then can we even begin to examine the paranormal. I think it's the reverse.
Well, just give me a little more about how you said. I mean, I'm not wedded to the other position, but tell me how is the paranormal the key to ordinary?
You, in our previous interview, used an interesting metaphor. I liked it a lot. The idea of fish in the ocean or amphibians in the ocean, seeing a fisherman's bobber floating on top of the ocean, and they can see the bobber, but they don't know what's beyond it. And they'll never understand the bobber, really what it's for, because they can't see past the bobber. And that's where I think we stand in relationship to the paranormal. Actually, there's this vast world out there. And if we want to understand consciousness, we have to begin to appreciate its enormity.
Absolutely. Well, in that sense, I agree. And the bobber metaphor still feels right to me. First of all, the shape of a bobber is round. I mean, I'm not a sport fisherman, but I know enough about fishing from growing up. It's a round object that exists on the surface of the water. And one day, an adventurous fish comes swimming around and sees this bobber and notices there's a hook connected to it, which is quite relevant. Well, we see these events, these apparent craft that, as Jung pointed out, are cylindrical, they're round, they're oval. So there's that. And the fish goes back and reports to its fellow fish, I've seen something very unusual. And what have you seen? I've seen something, come with me, I've seen the surface of something. What do you mean the surface of something? This isn't the only place there is, the fish says. We live in water. Because I went up and I looked up above the around this thing. I call it the bobber, and there's a whole other area. It's not water. We live in water, and so the idea that the fish is the last to know that it lives in water, and when it finds out it lives there's more than one dimension. That's very much, I think, what we're dealing with metaphorically with the UFO phenomenon and the paranormal in general.
Well, the metaphor of the bobber is very reminiscent of Plato's cave, isn't it?
Oh, it very much is. As you know, the great deal of discussion now in physics and really in popular culture and politics. Do we live in a simulation? And there's this gee whiz quality. If we live in a simulation, who or what created it, and who's ahead of us on the food chain? And did everybody but me miss the Plato's cave? You know, Plato essentially had this powerful allegory of a group of individuals sitting on a bench, and they were all looking forward the way I'm looking forward now and the way that our viewers are looking at the screen, and they are restrained in some way from looking to the side or looking from behind, and they don't know that behind them is a blazing fire. and that is reflecting what we know are shadows on the wall in front of them. And so the prisoners or the inhabitants of the cave, all of their lives, are convinced that what we know to be shadows are the primary forms. And then one of the prisoners one day turns around and looks and says, whoa, wait a minute. It has the same insight the fish does. There's something else going on. Goes out into the light of daylight, blinded by the brilliance of the direct objects or the direct reality, comes back, as often people do from the near-death experience, as I did, and tries to tell people what they've seen, people who see a UFO and are having some sense of downloads, of sense of information coming into their mind, which would not be possible in normal science, that come back and tell everybody that we're just living in a cave. And they say, no, we're not. And we don't welcome this news. So you've got to stop saying that. Just as, the Vatican paid a visit to Galileo and said, you've got to stop saying that the earth orbits the sun. He said, you don't have to take my word for it. Look through this telescope. We're not going to look through your telescope, as they famously said. Well, that's where we are with so much of this phenomenon. UFOs, near-death, paranormal phenomena. The agents of official culture in materialist science, in much of the news media, in much of academia say, we're not looking through your telescope. We're not interested in what you claim. Stop claiming it. It's not convenient.
When I first interviewed you back, I think in about 1993 or so, I hadn't yet published my book, The PK Man. It came out, as I recall, in the year 2000, although the first draft of it had been written in 1979. And it's a story of a man who believed himself to be in ongoing, regular telepathic communication with higher dimensional entities he called the space intelligences, who had bestowed upon him various paranormal abilities, including the ability to call UFOs, make them appear on demand in front of witnesses, and so on. And it strikes me that he's like the fellow who left the cave and came back to try to report what's going on, that we probably have a lot to learn from these so-called contactees. What do you think of that?
I think we do have a lot to learn from them. And I also think, as you know from my book, I have a chapter in my book, The UFO Paradox, called Who Do We Think We Are? Normally we say that, who do you think you are? It's a rhetorical question, get back, you're too big for your britches. But really, who do we think we are? And I ask the question in exploring a full range of mind-body, larger mind-body, exceptional functioning in human life. One of my favorites is the placebo effect. We can use this and come around and come back and forth with the UFO phenomenon. The placebo effect. We all see the news stories that are presented in mainstream media about a group of experimental subjects who are testing a new drug for, let's say, pain relief. The group is divided in two. There's the experimental group and the control group. It's all double blind. There's knowledge that some are going to get the real medicine. Some are not going to get the real medicine. Nobody knows who, but those are the parameters. And it turns out that as the procedure goes forward, the experiment is run, those who do not get the real drug have statistically significant benefits comparable to those who get the real drug. They also get the side effects as an additional whammy. And here's what I find always, now so right there, let's just look at this. That should not be possible. Or let's put it this way. It certainly suggests that the mind, consciousness, expectation, intention have palpable, tangible effects in the macro world. Those articles invariably call upon a doctor. I've written enough journalistic stories to know that you tie up a story like that by bringing in a physician. And the physician invariably says, oh, that effect, that's just the placebo effect. It was just a placebo. So I'm struck by the degree to which in our own realm every day we have examples of exceptional human functioning that are so obvious that they're out of plain sight. The phone rings one day, and as the phone rings, you walk across the room and you suddenly have a memory of your friend Bob from high school. You've thought about him a couple times today. Whatever happened to Bob, I'm going to check in on Bob. You don't need to check in on Bob. You pick up the phone, it's Bob. Now, Bob is calling you. You've been thinking of Bob. That's merely a coincidence in the same sense that the placebo is merely a placebo. Merely we live in a miraculous world, Jeffrey. We live in a magical world. But the magic is empirically obvious if we see it. And I think, and I'm using these analogies, synchronicities of phone calls, the placebo effect, the effects of Catholic contemplatives so deeply committed to their practice of identifying with the suffering of Jesus that they form stigmata on their body, emblems. They have skin writing. The holy words Ave Maria and so forth will appear written on the skin. I'm not suggesting we should practice developing such things as that. What it suggests to me is, and others, that if we don't develop our capacities, then they emerge in sideways, pathological ways with stigmata and so forth. So I'm a believer the UFO phenomenon is a call from the cosmos to play a bigger game, not only to acknowledge that reality is more than we think, but to cultivate our capacities to meet these phenomena on the common ground where we already are meeting them.
That's a very powerful statement, Keith. It reminds me of the time I heard you speak at a conference back in those days, back in about 1990 or so, the Angels and Aliens Conference.
I remember it very well. Again, like it was yesterday.
As I recall what you said, and please correct me if I'm wrong, because I probably don't have it quite right, but you seem to suggest that with regard to the UFO phenomenon, what should we expect when we deny aspects of our own psyches, that those aspects come and haunt us apparently from the external world?
That's right. Just because we've ruled for the last 300 years, ruled certain phenomena out of bounds, doesn't mean it goes away. I often say about the kind of phenomena we're discussing, when we have a coherent body of data, for example, the paranormal, the psychical psi phenomenon. When I bring this up to people who are solely in the UFO phenomenon world, they'll say, oh, well, isn't that stuff pretty speculative? Well, as you know, Jeffrey, there have been many meta-analyses written. Now, even the American Psychological Association magazine some years ago, the standard of the parapsychological experiments is so solid. The double-blind, triple-blind, quadruple-blind studies. So, yeah, the evidence is clear in that world. With the UFO phenomenon also, the coherence, the predictability of the patterns and so forth. So my argument is when we have terrains of existence, arenas of existence, territories of existence that consistently show up, but they're never on the map of society, maps of society and science or our definition of self, at some point, the parsimonious position would be to ask, has anybody checked the maps lately? Are our maps up to date? Are we dealing with accurate maps of reality? And on all of these issues, I would say no. So the territories are there. Nature has voted on its contents. You know, people often use the term anomalies. There are anomalies that aren't accounted for. That's true. The word anomalies is a good word. But remember, the anomaly is not something new in nature. An anomaly is apparent because it doesn't match the predictions of our maps. That's what makes it an anomaly. And when a paradigm shifts, it is because finally a new generation of scientists, observers comes along. Maybe they've had more experience in life. For example, these days there are more young scientists who have had experience with meditation, with expanded states of consciousness, with alternative psychotherapy, such as the breathing work of holotropic therapy, psychedelics, and who have studied the UFO phenomenon and paranormal evidence with an openness that previous generations haven't. Well, they come along and they say, okay, we're not going to be batting these anomalies off anymore. We need to expand our model to include the anomalies. And that's the heart of my argument in the UFO paradox.
You've raised two questions. One question is, what is reality? And the other question is, who are we?
Well, we're part of reality for certain, and we are part of this larger reality. All of these areas that I've talked about, we talk about in athletics. Athletes talk about the zone. Our mutual friend Michael Murphy of Esalen Institute, some years ago, he wrote a novel called Golf in the Kingdom about a mystical golf pro. The character was named Shivas Irons. What a perfect golf name. Shivas Irons was so well developed, somewhat like Castaneda's Don Juan. But Michael never said that Shivas Irons was a real character. So well drawn that people wrote him. Said, Mr. Murphy, where can I meet Shivas Irons? Because I play golf or I play sports and I've had these experiences. So Michael went to the San Francisco 49ers training camp and got permission to talk with the athletes for a few days. And as they would have dinners and have a few beers and relax together, and they trusted that this guy was a real guy, Michael would say, have any of you ever had experiences when you're in the intensity of the game that you can't explain? And Michael said he looked at them look at each other. Is it okay to say? And they would talk about being in the zone. Jim Brody, the quarterback for the 49ers, would say, Michael, I've had many occasions when I've gone to throw the ball and I've had only 2 or 3 seconds to complete the pass, but I had all the time I needed. Time slowed down. I saw a meta picture of the entire field. I felt sensations that were lifting me out of my body. I heard music that I can't explain, that I know nobody else was hearing. And so one by one, they began to say, well, I've had those too, and I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to sound weird. I don't even believe it, but I know that it's true. Well, here's the key. The next day then at breakfast, Michael would say, would any of you be willing to talk more about what you experienced? And they'd say, oh, you just got us talking, man. You just got us talking. We don't want to talk about that anymore. And Mike had the moment of clarity. He said, I'm watching what Freud called repression in action. They had a moment of freedom, permission to talk about their larger self. But today, the ceiling has lowered again. And that's how we are with UFO experiences, near-death experiences, the paranormal in general. We have them. We share them with others. And the collective mind, in many cases, says, no, you didn't. The collective Vatican response to Galileo, you didn't see what you say you saw through your telescope. Stop saying it. But I'm trying to give permission not to believe anything, but to follow the evidence wherever it leads.
If we try to view this situation from an Eastern point of view, from the point of view of the Hindu mythology and Buddhist mythology, we get a different picture of the world. The Buddhists talk about 10,000 Buddha realms, for example. The Hindus talk about the vimanas, these flying vehicles that the gods have. It would seem that part of our narrow perspective is that maybe we're too wedded to the Western intellectual tradition here.
I think so. I included some of that material about the Vijnanas in my book, and the yoga of the East has to do with these kind of phenomena. The science of the East, I should say. The science of somebody pointed out the science of Hinduism and Buddhism is yoga. The yoga of the West is empirical science that excludes all of that. And yet, as you also know, even in Hinduism and Buddhism, they recognize the existence of these larger powers, the siddhis, they're known as. Siddhis, plural, siddhis, powers and perfections of yoga. And you find many warnings in the traditions in those days to say, oh yeah, these powers can emerge, but what we need to go is directly for enlightenment. Don't get caught in the sideways path. The point is to get up and out of this world of suffering. Well, I'm of the view that what they didn't know, we know a lot now that they didn't know. We live in a developing universe. And I maintain, and others maintain, that these may well be these powers and perfections of yoga, the paranormal, mind in matter, telepathy, clairvoyance, and so forth, and the kinds of things Michael Murphy found when he visited the San Francisco 49ers. These may be limbs, and they can be seen as limbs and organs of our future nature, and that we are intended to live into them. As you said a little while ago, if we don't, in some sense, own these phenomena, they emerge as freakish phenomena. And so it's not on the short term, but in the long term arc, we are participating in the evolution of this universe. We're here to engage, and I don't find embodiment a hindrance. Oh, sure, there are times when embodied existence is difficult for all of us, but when I say I don't find embodiment a hindrance, it's as if the soul or the larger identity has said, let's, as an experiment, let's experience limitation. So we are living in forms with limitations, and yet these powers and the capacities, these potentials are implicit in matter and are emerging all around us. And that's something I think we need to meet and join.
Well, I wholeheartedly agree with you, Keith. Let's talk about the developments that have occurred over the last 30 years in the field of ufology. I suppose the big one is that so much has happened with the U.S. government acknowledging the reality of the phenomenon, even though they kind of hedge about it and say, something's going on. We don't know what.
Yeah, the UFO, I like to say, got an acronym upgrade a few years ago from UFO to UAP. So there's let's wipe the board clean. And Lou Elizondo came out with acknowledgement that he'd been leading a group of Pentagon researchers to study this phenomenon, which for decades, as you know, the government had officially said did not exist, and witnesses were routinely ridiculed. And so there is now an acknowledgement of unidentified phenomena, a theme that has been predominant in the UFO world. Can be stated as follows. Any day now, the lid on the government cover-up is going to blow sky high. Any day now, we're really finally there. And there is a new round of faith in that idea. I don't mean to make fun of it, but I do mean to remind those who are new to the phenomenon. You and I have been around for a while. You can tell by our haircuts that we've seen these patterns, we've seen this cycle go many times, and yet there is something new in the air right now. There's an acknowledgement of something going on. A former military official, intelligence official named David Grush, has penetrated as far as he could get, has come up with names and dates and locations of material that is being maintained allegedly by the aerospace companies. My only caution about that to those who came into the phenomenon around 2017, when the New York Times revealed the existence of the secret Pentagon group studying the phenomenon that is no longer secret, my only counsel would be to take a deep breath, say acknowledge we've been here before. This may be the first rodeo for you. It may seem that the cover-up is about to blow sky high. I don't know what we can expect. Here's what my thinking, Jeff. I don't know what we can expect to find in the hangars at McDonnell Douglas or Lockheed Martin. There may be some aspect of this phenomenon that exists in maintainable, permanent physical form, but we know enough from the paranormal dimensions of this phenomena that it is not something you don't store paranormal consciousness-based phenomena in a hangar. So there may be multiple phenomena going on under the deceptively singular acronym UFO. There may be more than, and UAP. There may be more kinds of things we're looking at. So it is a promising time, but it's also a good time to remember that these cycles, these what I call the mythic cycles of the phenomenon, the eternal recurring nature of these hopes and predictions. I think that's actually part of the phenomenon's learning curve. We are in some sense being conditioned. I don't mean that in a paranoid sense, that there's some force that is conditioning us. But there is a conditioning process where hopes are raised, hopes are dashed, and we live with increasing awareness of something in our presence that we can't explain. That's the key to pay attention to.
In our previous interview, in the very last minute or two, we brought up the question of the demonic, you could say projections, or you could say descriptions of UFO phenomena that typically come out of the Christian right-wing world or even the Muslim world. I did an interview with a Muslim recently who said these UFOs, they're just like the jinns that are known in Muslim mythology in every respect. Sometimes the jinns are good Muslims, but sometimes they can be treacherous and dangerous. And as I recall, you said, yes, we need to pay attention. Their point of view maybe is as important as any other.
Yeah, I think so too. I'm not a big fan of automatically importing the demonic frame of reference, the angelic frame of reference as, oh, these are just demons. These are just angels. Because when we go back and look at what are demons and angels, we don't really know. We don't really know for sure what they are, even in their own frame of reference. Although the religious worldviews do give explanations, but it's useful to pay attention to difficult aspects. The abductions are the alien abductions are certainly a sobering phenomena. And even then, it's not a monolithic phenomenon. As you know, John Mack, the late Harvard psychiatrist, got involved to his great risk. Harvard nearly ran him out of town until they realized what they would be dealing with if they really want to drive a scholar asking difficult questions out of the university. They decided not to do it. But John Mack found that a good number of the people who had been seemingly taken in relationship to these apparent beings and their craft had transformative experiences, positive experiences, and opening to larger realities. And it's worth noting that John Mack got into the abduction field partly because he ironically learned about my work, and we developed, he learned about abductions from Keith Thompson, and we used to joke about it. I said, are you giving me credit or are you blaming me? He said, well, I'm giving you credit for now, but we'll revisit it as we go along. And as he got increasingly in trouble with Harvard, I would ask him, are you still giving me credit for introducing you to this, or are you ready to give me blame? He said, no, I'm not gonna blame you, my friend. We're both asking questions that we have an understanding, don't have easy answers.
And John Mack's work was tragically, of course, cut short when he was killed 20 years ago or so in an automobile accident. And it seems like there hasn't been much follow-up on the abduction cases, or even more poignant cases involving ostensible pregnancies and supposed hybrid, half human, half alien beings.
Right. That was one of the questions even John Mack would raise with his fellow researchers, Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs, the historian from Temple University. Both of them I give great credit for asking tough questions and putting themselves on the limb, or putting themselves out on a limb. But John Mack said we have a problem ultimately with the idea of the abductees did tend to be shown when the abduction phenomenon was front and center. They were shown babies. There were scenarios, there were displays that were made of babies that appeared to be hybrids. And so John Mack finally asked, well, then where are the babies? Where are the hybrids? They live among us, is the response. But they're so indistinguishable at this point, they're like us, which I find an interesting metaphor. The hybrid, is that in some sense, is that a symbolic way to think about the gradual emergence of normal human nature and larger human nature? Normal humanity, super normal humanity. Is that what hybrid really represents? In the sense that, we are hybrid. We don't know about all of our elements. We are multiple amphibians. We are, just as other animals came ashore from the water onto land, they developed their gills turned into lungs, not instantaneously, but through the evolutionary process. Are we also emerging? I like to use the metaphor of a frog sitting in a pond on a lily pad, looking around. The frog has enough with its optical sensation, with its optical apparatus, has enough awareness to catch flies, and also to avoid being prey. But a frog does not see the full panoramic, the full capacity. Are we like frogs with our own limited sensorium, but we also have greater sensorium? And that is what these visionary experiences represent? We are getting glimpses of what Michael Murphy calls a larger Earth. That we're coming ashore to a larger Earth. And that is, in a sense, evolutionary developmental sense. We are coming into possession of our greater capacities. I like to think that way, and I think the evidence points in that direction.
It's so interesting that you use the very same metaphor of the frog in our interview 30 years ago. Other people have used the metaphor of the caterpillar. The caterpillar who goes into a cocoon, you might say death is like a cocoon, and emerges as a completely different being, a butterfly, with capacities that the caterpillar never had.
I love that too. It's another favorite of mine. The word imaginal experience is often used for this phenomenon. Jeffrey Kripal of Rice University likes the term imaginal, partly because it resurrects imagination from a degraded standing that it has in Western philosophy. Oh, that's just imagination. That's just the placebo. This reductionism. But imaginal refers to the imagination as an organ that opens into larger seeing. But the word imaginal, as you may know, is also a biological term that refers to a stage of the larva. I'm reminded when I hear the caterpillar metaphor, to which I really respond myself and with which I resonate. It was an old cartoon that goes with a couple of caterpillars on the ground, and they're looking at a butterfly flying over. One of the caterpillars says to the other, "You'll never get me up in one of those." Oh, yeah? Just wait. You're going to get up in one of those. That's your next stage of your development. But that's where we are. You'll never get me to believe in UFOs. No belief is required. I had an experience. Well, I was introduced to this phenomenon, as you know, from my book, as a 12th grade student, as a 6th grade student, 12 years old. It was my turn to give a current events report in class. I reported on the famous Michigan swamp gas case. And I simply told what had happened. I revealed it to my classmates. And my teacher said to me, "Keith, this was a good presentation. You have the makings of a scientist or a journalist or a detective. And what I mean by that is follow the evidence where it leads." So that's my whole approach. I didn't become interested at that time in UFOs because I thought there was a paranormal dimension. I didn't know about that at the time. But as I began to study the cases, I began to see, well, the paranormal appears to be normal, but not in wide enough awareness to be recognized as normal. So I'm going to include that. So I'm a big fan of empiricism, but multidimensional empiricism. There's a phrase a philosopher in science, C.W. Broad, had, synoptic empiricism. Syn is the word with. Optic is to see with, to see different frames of reference with each other. So I take the UFO phenomenon as a circle, and I take the near-death phenomenon as a circle. Well, look, in the Venn diagram sense, there's an overlap. Now let's take a circle of shamanic experiences from shamanism. Well, look at that. There's an overlap with the other three areas. So it isn't just to assemble areas promiscuously and try to find commonalities, but when the commonalities emerge, I'm interested in bringing that forward in the spirit, not of faith or belief, but of empirical evidence. Follow the evidence where it leads is what my sixth grade teacher said to me. And it was the best advice I ever got.
It's interesting to me you use the term circle again and again. Earlier, you used the term bobber in relationship to the actual shape of UFOs, which is something that Carl Jung pointed out back in the 1950s, the circle of the flying saucer. It was for him a symbol of wholeness, a sense that the UFO phenomenon was beckoning us toward a greater wholeness, or what Jung might call individuation. And as I recall from your talk long ago at the Angels and Aliens conference, you were saying something to the effect that we are in a culture that diminishes the feminine. And as a result of that, all of these phenomena are aspects of the feminine coming back, returning from the repressed.
Well, that was Jung's great insight about not only about the feminine, which he very much valued, but also Jung's insight was he shared the common ground with Freud that there is something below the mountaintops. The next level down is the unconscious. Freud, as you know, simply said the unconscious is nothing more, is merely the repository of stuff we ignore or repress or forget. Jung was with him on that. But Jung had happened into, by opening to his, in many respects, to his own experience, which he defined so beautifully in his last work, The Red Book, which is coming forward in recent years. But Jung said there's a different dimension of the unconscious, the collective unconscious, which is more than a repository. It is a creative matrix that contains all of history, all cultures, all mythologies. And that is a very great challenge to understand, that we are embedded in that collective unconscious. Jung's eventual recognition was, rather than the collective unconscious existing inside us in the material realm, we exist in the collective unconscious. And so his great insights about the phenomenon of synchronicity, to me, that is the UFO paradox. It's the paradox of paranormal, and I know paranormal phenomena, and I know you've dealt with synchronicity in your model around synchronicity and resonance and so forth, around reincarnation. But let's keep it simple. The essence of synchronicity is acausal, non-causal, meaningful overlap between the inner world, what we call the inner world, and the outer world. And we recognize there is a interface between the two. The two realms are continuous. And with that, we have then the great experiment, which the Nobel Prize, as you know, just a little over a year ago, was given to entangled particles, to the idea that photons at great distance, non-local distances, remain in touch. So there is a network of connectivity to all of existence. That won the Nobel Prize. Is it being discussed in today's news media? Is today's science looking at it? It is, again, the example of how we can exist in the face of this evidence and it doesn't resonate. And yet it increasingly does, because the anomalies, as Thomas Kuhn argued so beautifully in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, eventually a paradigm acquires enough anomalies that finally, instead of trying to bat them all down, get rid of them, the paradigm accommodates, a new paradigm accommodates the things that don't fit. And that's what I think I'm about. That's what many others are about. How do we simply acknowledge the anomalies? If they aren't meaningful, then we dismiss them. But across too many areas, we see evidence that they are meaningful. And the near-death experience is a particularly good example of how a scientific approach has been successful. We have made incredible progress with the near-death experience and understanding it, since the days of Raymond Moody. So it's very, very encouraging in many respects.
Let me ask you this question point blank, because I know so many of the things we're discussing are conversations we could easily have had, and in fact did have 30 years ago. What new insights have you gained over the decades?
I'll share one with you. It has to do with, I used Joseph Campbell's thinking. I got to know Joseph Campbell, and I got to take some classes with him and work with him directly before he was well known. And his 3-stage hero's journey model, there's first the stage in which one is separated from their normal reality. They go into a middle range. They go into a middle area of betwixt and between. They're no longer what they were before the extraordinary experience, but they're not on the other end of it either. I went to Pascagoula, Mississippi, to meet with Calvin Parker, the last witness in the famous double abduction case with Charlie Hickson and Calvin Parker. And he told me the most amazing thing. He said that he had actually changed his name, not legally, but he'd started calling himself Randy, created the name Randy, because he was in between who he used to be before this incredible experience of abduction on the banks of the Mississippi River, the Pascagoula River, I should say. And he was in this realm that the only way he could deal with it was to go by the name Randy, live by the name Randy. He chose a new identity. One day he was at a funeral with his wife, and unthinkingly he signed the register, Calvin Parker. This is after he'd been living as Randy. And the person behind him said, "Oh, you're Calvin Parker. You're the Calvin Parker of the abduction. This is Calvin Parker of the abduction. Let's talk with him." And he and his wife said, "This is not a fair thing to do to a man's funeral." They left. And on the way to the parking lot, his wife said, "Calvin, you've got to write a book. You've got to deal with this. It's time." And it just had happened that Calvin had gotten an invitation from a publisher. And he finally decided to. So what's my point? He finally decided to tell his story rather than hide out as Randy. And in the process of doing so, when the book was published and he went to some book readings in his hometown, other witnesses, Calvin Parker's back. They came to the book signing and said, "Mr. Parker, I saw what happened that night myself. I saw those lights down by the river myself. I knew you and Charlie were telling the truth, but we held back because we saw what had happened to you. We didn't want to be ridiculed." So I think that my reason for bringing this up, one thing I've learned, I think there are a significant number of individuals who've had UFO experiences, near-death experiences, larger-than-life paranormal experiences, reach for the phone, think about their high school friend. It's their high school friend calling. They're finally saying, "We live in a larger world. I'm not going to hide it anymore." And so I think one thing I've learned is that there are a growing number of people for whom a culture of this new consciousness is growing. And that is a movement forward. And I find it very exciting. Meanwhile, the same dynamics still exist. Ordinary people report extraordinary phenomena. Agents of official culture in media, in science, in academia said it didn't happen. And so in the fertile void of that deadlock, experiences are reported, experiences are denied. They go pressed into the underground where they work on our psyche symbolically in remarkable ways. And that is a whole area of the book that I deal with as well. How do we deal with the way in which these dynamics do not allow a straightforward processing of this information? And yet there is growing evidence that people are finding their ways into. Even psychotherapy and the helping professions are getting far more sympathetic to these phenomena and helping people negotiate this rite of passage, these initiations, which is what they are. I think we're looking at in Jung's model of individuation, including material from the unconscious into the identity of the ego. That is individuation, bringing more of the unconscious. I think we're engaged in cosmic individuation now, allowing the return of the repressed in terms of these larger territories into mainstream, ordinary, day-to-day reality.
I'm glad you brought up the case of Pascagoula, Keith, because back in the 1970s, when that case occurred, I was a graduate student at Berkeley, and my professor was James Harder, who is the researcher from the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, who went and actually subjected Calvin Parker and Charles Hickson to hypnosis to verify and validate their experiences. Another point you raise in your book is that this town of Pascagoula has created an event to commemorate that incident, much the same as in Pleasant Point, New York, commemorating the sightings of what was called back then the Mothman, another similar incident. These events get embedded into folklore, into ritual and customs in these communities.
And there's nothing quite like a plaque on the Pascagoula River, which there's a photograph of Calvin Parker in the book showing Keith Thompson, the author who came to visit. He said, "That's where it was, Mr. Thompson." I can't talk about Calvin Parker without adopting a Pascagoula accent, because I spent time with him. I listened to him tell the story over and over. And by the way, what makes that case really remarkable is that the sheriff told those boys, told Calvin and Charlie, "You better not be running us around on a wild goose chase here." And they said, "We are absolutely not." So what the sheriff did, after interviewing them both separately, according to the proper protocols of criminal investigation, which you studied in your early part of your own career, criminal justice, he put the two guys in the same room with a tape recorder, voice-activated, hidden tape recorder that they knew nothing about. And these two men described in conversation with themselves the terror that they felt and how were they going to deal with this. I have the complete transcript in the book, and the sheriff came, got the tape recorder, and listened to it and said, if these boys made this up, they should be in Hollywood. So the attempt to catch them in a lie actually served to enhance their credibility. And to this day, to the end of his life, Calvin Parker passed away last year. But I said, what is it like not being believed? What is it like being so systematically disbelieved? And he leaned back on his porch. We were listening to Otis Redding singing on the dock of the bay. He said, Mr. Thompson, it doesn't matter that you're not believed. I don't mind looking back, not being believed. I understand the debunkers. They're like bouncers in a bar. Their job is to defend what they think is reality and dismiss people like it. I still don't know what happened that night, but I do know something happened that was not ordinary. And that's why I've never changed my story. Well, that's a very powerful witness, and it gives me the shivers even now to think about that.
Well, it's a good note to end on, Keith. It's as if we can talk about the UFOs up and down, day and night, but at the end of our discussion, the mystery remains.
The mystery does remain, and I am when people ask me what do I take away and what would I like to share with others, it is the words of Suzuki Roshi, the Zen master who came from Japan and Northern California decades ago, with his famous book about beginner's mind. And he said, in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there aren't many. There are few. So I'm a big believer in beginner's mind. I to this day, I don't know what a UFO is or is not, but I do know that it's real and that it's a call, as I say, it's a call from the cosmos to upgrade our maps to this greater reality. It is news from the universe. And what we've learned from every other area of life, we don't do well when we systematically disregard news from the universe, whether it's the facts of our family, the facts of our lives in any respect. In which part of our lives does it work to systematically disregard evidence of reality? I don't know of one. I'd like to find it. I'd like to get better at it. If there's a world in which denying and forgetting and pretending is better than being real, I'd like to learn more about that. I haven't found one. Have you?
Well, one could apply that to politics very easily these days. Well, Keith, this has been such a joy to connect with you again after so many years. I've really loved this conversation, so many facets and points that we touched. I want you to know you are welcome back on New Thinking Aloud whenever you please. Just let me know and I'll be happy to have you.
Well, given the advances in longevity these days, maybe I'll be back. We plan on being back in 30 years, but I'd love to be back sooner than that. So I've got some ideas for future work and my next book that I think you'll find some real commonalities. And so maybe back soon. I certainly hope to be back sooner than 30 years.
Let's see how soon we can make it happen.
Let's do that, Jeffrey. Thank you so much for inviting me to stop by and talk.
It's been a great joy, Keith. Thank you. And for those of you watching or listening, thank you for being with us because you are the reason that we are here.
In the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a PDF copy or order a beautiful printed copy of issue 6 of the new Thinking Aloud magazine.